Hello and welcome to a Kyiv Independent discussion with a guest that we're very lucky to have on today, John Spencer, Head of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute. John, on a visit to Kyiv, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Today, I want to focus with you on probably, maybe not the most decisive, but one of the most, if not the most brutal battle that's going on in the war today that everyone's talking about, obviously, Bakhmut. So just to start off, where are we at the moment? What does the fighting look like in the city, in what you're seeing?
Unfortunately, it's a very brutal, we usually say urban battles are combat in hell.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing in Bakhmut is probably some of the worst fighting that you can imagine, with great sacrifice on both sides, unfortunately, daily. Fighting over this objective, which has what I get a lot of is why.
Yeah.
Why, and is it worth it? Which is really hard to, depending on who you're talking to have that conversation on. The objectives in war, the political nature of warfare, and even in a geographic location of Bakhmut, where I honestly think the reason has changed over time, which then changed the value that a country will invest in it. And that's what we're seeing. But we're seeing just brutal warfare and really a day-to-day tipping point of which way it will go.
About that, we've seen reports from UK Intelligence International Institute for the Study of War talking about the situation stabilizing around Bakhmut, potentially culminating. But then you look at the map and you see the situation with the city being surrounded on almost all sides and the last remaining road being under fire control. Can you talk about stabilization or culmination in a situation like this?
It's really hard, and when you don't have a clear organization, especially on the Russian side, and when you talk about different groups being pieced together, I mean, culmination for me is kind of a teacher of war has clear definitions. One of them being when you can no longer continue your mission. So for the Russians, it would be they could no longer advance, right? So people feel that there's this culmination coming where they've gone as far as they're going to get, and they won't be able to do that. One of my friends calls it the glove, won't be able to close the glove around Bakhmut, which has a very interesting topography on the west side, and even though the battle has progressed past the Bakhmut River and into the west side, into the dense urban, which is hard. Another evaluation of culmination is just a percentage of lost. So as an analyst, you could say, hey, look, this military unit is 50% casualties of men, weapons, and equipment. It is close to culminating. But that's assuming the values of the other country, where in some cases we know that Russia doesn't care if they lose 100% of that formation. They're going to keep telling them to move forward until they're all gone because they don't value, depending on what population it is. So the culminations are real tricky. I agree with you. It's really hard to say that, to know for a fact who's getting ready to culminate when there's so much action going on a day-to-day basis. On both sides, really on the Ukrainian side, it's a question of, do you pull the Ukrainians out? Because the value of Bakhmut as a military objective is not much to keep fighting there, and it gets to the reasons of why the battle has progressed.
Right. Yeah. Following on that, like we had the loss of Soledar in January, and what we saw in the nature of the urban fighting there is that once the Russians broke into the urban area, it was over in a very short time, actually. Do you think there's a difference here in Bakhmut? Like once the Russians do break into that built-up area, which we are seeing in the past few days that they are doing, who's got the advantage there? Yeah,
that's tough. We have this saying with all these variables that matter, like what is the goal of both sides? What is the investment they're willing to give on both sides? So just when one force enters the urban terrain doesn't necessarily mean that there's a chance of loss, more so if they were just on the exterior. Actually, more fighting has happened on the outside of Bakhmut than inside Bakhmut. Different formations are given the task of holding the inside. Yes, usually we say that the defender has an advantage, not the advantage, because he's in really defendable positions, and that's what we're seeing in Bakhmut. If you're in some of those really old Soviet-style apartment buildings with basements, you can hold them for a long time, but not forever. That's where we usually say the defender has an advantage, not the advantage. And if the other side can push enough forces in, then it becomes the attrition value. And this is what we've seen in Bakhmut's change, where it starts off with 5 dead Russian soldiers to 1 Ukrainian. Well, most analysts believe that attrition value is now getting close to parity, even in a dense urban fight, where keeping terrain against an attacker, the advantages really come down to what resources you have, which is why artillery ammunition and other resources, and as you said, a resupply route now under fire's control, making it really hard to resupply those forces. So the advantage can actually change from block to block.
Yeah, so we had Rob Lee actually say the same thing about this attrition equation, how the choice to hold it is no longer necessarily mathematically in Ukraine's favor, and Ukraine is losing some very experienced brigades. So if I can put you on the spot and ask you about this decision to stay, to what extent do you think it's political? And what are the other motivations behind it? And is it the right decision at the moment?
Yeah, that one's actually an easier one for me. And Rob Lee's a good friend, and so is Michael Kaufman on the attritional values. But warfare is not just numbers. It is not just attrition values. It is not the value of sacrifice, changed based on one country. Politics and the war is human, and it is political. And the value of Bakhmut politically has greatly changed since the beginning of the fight for Bakhmut 6 months ago. It changed in December. The president visited. It changed. It continues to change. I don't think anybody can know whether it's makes sense to hold it without knowing everything that Ukraine knows. That's a really tough commander decision to make on, and know what else is being planned. To know if even there's value on keeping the fight there just to keep the world's attention there. There is value politically in that, and there's value militarily in keeping the attention there. Do I think that there's so much value that Ukraine would sacrifice everything that's in there right now? No. They get to make the decision, though. This is what we call the initiative. Some people might think that Russia has an initiative in fighting in Bakhmut. They're pressing, they're attacking, and that they're driving Ukraine's decisions. I don't think so. I actually think Ukraine is fighting Russians there because that's where Russians have decided they want to fight for. They can make a decision to pull back and let Russia have that ground, although that of course is not a good decision at any moment. So it's really arguable on why should it continue, and the numbers matter. Of course, like you said, valuable brigade leadership, valuable trained soldiers, and that is hard to replace. But we, as in the analysts, have no clue on what is the other factors, both politically and militarily, factoring into why continuing to fight in Bakhmut. It isn't just because what Mike calls the sunk cost fallacy. Why is this battle continuing? Well, because it's been going on for a while. There are other variables there as well.
So you think there's like inherent value in a sense in just the fact that you're denying Russia what they wanted to do, even if that's costly to you as well. You're stopping them right there.
Yes, that is one simple. Like there's a long list. There's one simple one of Russia. If it takes Bakhmut, gets nothing militarily. Politically, it gets to say it has a victory. There is value in not allowing Russia to have a victory, even domestically for the Russian population or internationally.
But still, what you see now, what we're seeing, the way the map's moving, would you describe it as a holding operation at this point? Or is there possibly an aim to counterattack on the flanks and kind of relieve some of that pressure? Or is it just a matter of time?
Yeah, so what's going on right now is called an area defense. It's terrain-based, you're holding ground. There are only 3 types of defenses, and the other one's called a mobile defense. And that's where you have a force like what's going on in Bakhmut holding, and everybody's as in the enemy is focused on attacking them, and then you bring in another force. It's called a striking force, and that's why it's a mobile defense. And you smash the attackers against the defenders. Am I saying that Ukraine has that capability? I don't know. Would it make sense if and when we ever find that that's one of the courses of action? Absolutely. And then the other one's withdrawal. That's the other defense. Withdraw when you want, under the conditions you want. Again, some of the early theories were this was a place where you could attrit the Russian war machine, whether that's Wagner or other military forces. Now they're saying because of the attrition values that that's no longer the case. I'd say that I don't know if that's true. Right. They're still killing Russians.
Yeah, and a lot of them. In a lot of reporting on Bakhmut recently, including from the Kyiv Independent, from Washington Post, has talked about complaints from the soldiers about not enough support, about really recently mobilized, inexperienced units being thrown in, about not enough artillery. I was up near Soledar recently, and they said they had 5 mortar shells for about 10 mortars every day. And also not enough support from armor potentially. But we also know that Ukraine is 100% planning this big offensive operation somewhere, probably the south in spring, summer. So they need to kind of save up for that in a sense. How do you see that equation? Do you think, how important are those offensive plans in the way they approach the defense of Bakhmut?
Yeah, so there's different levels of war, right? So there's the old soldier level that we call the tactical, and then there's the operational, as in the campaign. Like where would a spring or summer offensive go? Yeah. And how important it is to keep Bakhmut going on, to divert attention from that. How important is it to ask soldiers to sacrifice with this much greater plan in mind and in the motion, which is very, very common in history, that the people being asked to sacrifice don't know what their greater plan is. You try to tell those forces as much as you can. I think it can factor in greatly, but I have no insider information, like we said, nor can they let anybody know what the greater plan is. And is that sacrifice purposeful, or is it really the state of military logistics for the Ukrainian military along the front line? Or is it purposeful and they know about it and not addressing it, continuing it because of this other plan? It's really hard to know. Would it be atypical? No. So it could either be that it's a really sad state, or it's a calculated decision.
Or a bit of both.
A bit of both.
Yeah, sure. About the terrain in the area, people say a lot that maybe what they should withdraw because the area behind, around Chasiv Yar, is perhaps a better place to defend. But then if you look at the map north of Chasiv Yar, between Bakhmut all the way to Kramatorsk, basically, there are very few cities. There's this rolling terrain. So what do you think the equation there is? Is that a real issue that, okay, you could hold them at Chasiv Yar, but then they could continue this bulge in the north and take a lot more territory?
Yeah, I think that's another calculated decision. That's assuming that the Russians have a lot of capability left. That if they did get past Bakhmut, most people were pretty sure, well, you're not going to Kramatorsk, you're not advancing much farther. If they had the capability, which we're almost positive they don't, could they do a big flanking maneuver and head and seize more ground? But the problem is if you're going to seize ground, you've got to hold the ground, which is what we've seen even in the Kharkiv offensive, is that they don't have the resources to hold large parts of ground that are urban-centric. Because while great swaths of ground matter, it is you only hold that by holding the critical nodes, which are the urban areas. So I would say, if I was a betting, it's all about calculated risk. The risk of them having the capability to make that big of a mover over that much ground, it's much less than trying to take a critical node with a lot of resources in a small place. This is the problem with Russia. In Ukraine, Ukraine is geography. It is great swaths of geography, and Russia doesn't have the capability to control it all, even in eastern Donbass.
Speaking of actually the Russian forces and the state of them and what they could do in the future, what do you think is the significance of this Wagner factor in the battle for Bakhmut, and what could happen afterwards? The troops they use, the tactics they use, how has that shaped this battle?
There's a time and a place for the tactics that have been used, and the Wagner group has learned. Even in the urban fights, the tactics of the Russians, the tactics of the Wagner group were different in the beginning as they are now. Even the use of unskilled soldiers they are utilizing techniques in which they can make it effective and giving them single points, go to that point and take that ground. It is not as good as a quality military formation with a echelon of leadership that can accomplish greater things. There's a time and a place for that factor, and Russia has been shown effective to insert that factor when it wants to in special locations like Soledar, where there's an achievable goal in which they can take this lower quality but effective in a certain tactic, force and insert it. But we're also seeing that doesn't work in all situations, where you do need a Russian-trained formation with an echelon of equipment and leadership and training. There's all these calculations matter, and time matters. So they learn, but they also get it treated, and it is a complex calculation.
So yeah, right now we see some news about Avdiivka potentially becoming a second Bakhmut, and I was there just last week. It was pretty horrible, to be honest. But there you have you don't hear much about Wagner being operational. It's more the Russian military, the regular Russian military. Is this kind of Bakhmut the new style of the Russian offense all along the front? Are they going to try and repeat that same situation?
I don't think so. I don't think they're going to put Wagner in the lead of any operation in the future. I think this is again why the political nature of that battle changed. The Wagner leadership wanted it to be a success for them, so they could say, "Look, I can be your winning force. The Russian military can't. Me, the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, all these can be." That was taken from them at Baku. So I don't think that this will be a model for going forward at all. And I don't think the Russian military wants it to be the model going forward at all.
Just to finish up, you talked about morale earlier in the Battle of Kyiv, but now we're seeing a very different style of warfare, just completely dominated by artillery. And as we talked about, like some units are potentially playing the role of some kind of sacrificial lamb for a future offensive. From what you see, like, is this sustainable? These units that have been in the thick of it, in hell for so many months. What's that like? The morale situation after that long fighting?
Yeah, it can be really. It can break a unit. It literally can. But this is where, and I actually wrote a book that this is such a passion of mine. That there's so many variables. Morale is just a feeling that goes up and down day to day. The will to fight is the critical thing. And it can dampen, morale can go so low that you don't want to fight anymore. You don't see the value of your sacrifice. You don't see the reason you're fighting for. That takes a lot of leadership from the small unit to the national level. That's why the visits to the front line are so important. That's why the messages that they know, that people know and they understand. That's when your morale starts to tank, and you see, like we've seen on the Russian side, which we don't see in the Ukrainian side, like, I'm so forgotten that I don't see the value of my sacrifice, and I will not fight. I will surrender, or I just won't fight. That's when morale or these intangibles comes into play. So in places where you see it visibly waning or being stressed significantly, and you interview a soldier, that's where leadership and other things that you know can improve morale have to be implemented. And these are the lessons that this war has taught people. Like, that is as important as the weapons or even giving them more ammunition, is ensuring that the soldiers' morale and the cohesion, like, they have to be in it together. Because the worst thing is when that soldier you're talking to is like, hey, we're forgotten about, they don't care about us, I'm alone. That's where all this stuff breaks. Like, all these lessons are known in the history of war. It's when they're forgotten and they're let to kind of what I say almost atrophy. Small unit cohesion, all that. Forces can be without food, without water for a long time, without ammunition, and still do amazing things because they have the will to fight.
Right. Okay. With all that in mind, looking forward, specifically, if we take the Donbass, this very built up area, and the momentum that's going back and forth, how do you think it's going to develop into spring and summer?
Yeah, there's going to be a major operation, like you said. Most people are guaranteed. That operation will be as significant to the morale of the Ukrainian soldiers as it is to the Ukrainian people, as it is to the international community. The objectives are important, but the actual execution of the operation is what, like it was in World War II, even for the people that feel like they're being sacrificed, if they know that that's starting to happen, it will increase morale and motivation greatly, because it is the reason. They, without even being told, they know that we are fighting. They haven't forgotten. That operation is so significant, not just for so many reasons, but especially what we were just talking about. It will send a signal to everybody, and I'm sure they'll do whatever they can in multimedia and like all this to let people know, even with the objectives, which will be significant in the war, and that's why everybody wants to know where they're going and what they're going to do. Like, I care about that, yes, but I actually care about it actually just happening because of what it's going to do for the will of the soldier, of the people, and of the alliance.
Thank you very much for these really insightful comments. Really happy to have you on board, and yeah, good luck in the rest of your trip, and we'll be happy to see you again soon.
Thank you.